Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending this event on connecting the U.S. innovation ecosystem to national security priorities, a project we've been working on with the help and support of Mike Brown and DIU for some time now. I was actually in the room when Secretary Carter announced that he was creating this, I think about 6 years ago, and we'll talk about that later on to see where we've come. And at the time, I thought, good luck. So we've done better than my original expectations. What we'll talk about today is how innovation has changed, how we align the innovation ecosystem, which is largely commercial, to national security. And we'll focus on ways to reform how the federal government acquires technology. We have 3 segments. The first segment will be recorded remarks by Congressman James Langevin, another real leader in the field. Then we'll have a panel discussion with John Sargent, specialist at CRS in science and technology policy, someone whose writings I use a lot. And of course, William Greenwalt, now a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, but of course, a longtime veteran of the Hill. And I guess now we can call you an escapee, but 2 real experts as well. We'll have concluding remarks then from Mike Brown. So without further ado, perhaps we can start with the video and then go to the panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Congressman Jim Langevin, and I represent Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. I want to begin by thanking Dr. John Harmony for inviting me to speak today. And I also want to congratulate him and the CSIS team, particularly my dear friend and cybersecurity mentor, Jim Lewis, for their fantastic reports on linking our innovation ecosystem to national defense needs. As the chair of the new subcommittee on cyber, innovative technologies, and information systems on the House Armed Services Committee, I'm guided by the principle that we should never send our warfighters into a fair fight. With this goal in mind, my former ranking member, Elise Stefanik, and I created the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and charged them with developing a whole-of-government approach to not only harness AI, but many emerging technologies. While we can point to the Defense Innovation Unit, Small Business Innovation Research, and Small Business Technology Transfer efforts, and adoption of dozens of NSCAI legislative recommendations as clear progress toward improving how our defense establishment makes use of new technologies, our work is far from complete. We need to continue to invest in our innovation ecosystem, streamline authorities, and dismantle the barriers that keep our military from rapidly adopting new technologies. In today's strategic environment, the United States' historic military and economic competitive advantages is not guaranteed. We are no longer competing primarily against the technologically inferior adversaries that define the global war on terror. Instead, we face persistent and dangerous challenges from highly capable and advanced great power competitors who seek to undermine the status quo of U.S. leadership and global power. If the U.S. is to remain a global leader in technology, we cannot simply rest on our laurels. We must actively execute a comprehensive science and technology strategy that is an annex to the National Defense Strategy to advance the innovation that feeds our economic and national security objectives. One of the National Security Commission on AI's recommendations was to create such a strategy that identifies and prioritizes research efforts that will produce the critical capabilities that our warfighters need. By connecting it to the National Defense Strategy, the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering can hold the department's focus on these long-term efforts, helping them garner just as much attention and resources as the short-term alligators at your boat. So this year, the House Committee on Armed Services just overwhelmingly passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which included this S&T strategy. And I am confident that future national defense strategies will be informed by the identification, prioritization, development, and fielding of emerging capabilities and technologies. These critical capabilities depend on robust and sustained investment in basic and applied research and development that expands our foundational understanding of science and drives technological advancements. Over the last 70 years, our country emerged as the leader in innovation because the government funded basic research programs and the private sector built on those foundations. While academics, investors, and policymakers understand the importance of science and technology investment, follow-through often comes up short. In the private sector, businesses hesitate to assume the risk of expensive R&D that has no clear near-term revenue-generating potential. In Congress, basic and applied R&D funding often receives bipartisan support in principle, but then is sacrificed for investments in more immediate issues. This short-sightedness means that we'll be left to chase future technology development rather than lead it, and will leave us unprepared for future national security threats. For example, where would we be in the coronavirus pandemic if DARPA had not invested in mRNA technology 10 years ago? Given basic and applied research's critical role in innovation, I'm incredibly proud of what my subcommittee accomplished in its inaugural year. While this year's President's budget included the largest defense R&D investment to date, it cut funding for basic research. So the House Armed Services Committee addressed this funding shortfall and passed its NDAA with an additional $4.4 billion for research development, test and evaluation accounts within my subcommittee's jurisdiction, including a 32% increase in defense-wide RDTE funding, a 14.5% increase to the Army, an additional $1 billion for DARPA, and $1.1 billion for key AI-related applications. Our work is not done, though, and 1 year of increased investment will not guarantee our continued technological advantage. In addition to sustained RDT&E funding, we must invest in and continue to strengthen a science and technology workforce. We live in an environment where small groups of driven visionaries can disrupt the status quo and usher in breathtaking change. We are now in a race for talent with our adversaries to harness and nurture these innovators. So we must do better. We need to fully integrate STEM topics into every aspect of K-12 education while offering more lab-based classes, project-based learning, robotics, and workshops that fuse science and creativity. While our world-class universities and unmatched innovation tech companies currently attract the brightest minds in the world, the government needs to improve how it leverages the best talent to advance national security objectives. I continue to champion a pathway to citizenship for foreign talent to work on U.S. defense research projects. If we don't attract and harness the world's best talent, others certainly will. The military cannot also rely solely on the private sector to build this tech-savvy workforce. To truly capture innovative technology's full potential for national security, we have to build a government workforce that is just as savvy. We took another step forward in cultivating this talent as I amended the NDAA to include the creation of a digital talent recruiting officer and new occupational series for digital career fields. Investment in science and technology research and the underlying workforce only lay the groundwork for linking innovation to national security. The government must also improve how it adopts new technology. For too long, DoD acquisition teams have prioritized hardware requirements, leaving software as an afterthought. We slowly improve legacy systems using incredibly costly and time-consuming means. Meanwhile, our most innovative technologies fall into the aptly named Valley of Death. Well, we spend years stringing along promising technology in the lab, but then fail to secure the funding necessary to pull it into procurement. After years of empty promises, companies turn towards the private sector to commercialize their ideas, or they go bankrupt. Either way, our warfighters lose out on technologies with the potential to dominate future battlefields. My ultimate goal is to change our acquisition system from being hardware-centric to software-centric, and that we build open architecture systems that can easily incorporate new advancements. The next warfighter jet or ship should be developed, operated, and upgraded as a flying or sailing computer wrapped in a hull. So not every program has to be run as a major weapons program bought in large blocks with decades-long development, procurement, and sustainment cycles. Why not buy commercially available technology on 18-month or shorter timelines that fosters continuous innovation among competing firms, or continuously develop, test, and deliver new software capability to the field? With these goals in mind, my subcommittee, Mark, included several provisions that work to bridge the valley of death, including a program to match promising critical technology producers with qualified intermediaries to help them navigate the acquisition process, as well as service programs that more effectively transition small business projects into full production. Additionally, my ranking member, Jim Banks, and former ranking member, Stefanov, introduced a pilot program to facilitate the agile acquisition of technologies for warfighters. While I'm proud of the progress that we continue to make in addressing the valley of death, we won't realize the full benefits of our commercial sector innovation until rapid technology adoption becomes the main output of our acquisition process, not the novelty of a pilot program. So while I laid out some daunting tasks that our country and national security community must accomplish in the era of great competition, I'm optimistic about the future. There is no dispute over the need to reform key institutions to better compete with our adversaries. We've seen lawmakers on both sides of the aisle enthusiastically support key legislative recommendations from the National Security Commission on AI, and my subcommittee prides itself on approaching these issues in a bipartisan fashion. What we need are the ideas of academia, industry, and government on how to better link our innovation ecosystem to national security needs so that our warfighters never have to go into a fair fight. With that in mind, I want to thank you again for inviting me to speak. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Congressman Langevin is one of the true leaders, not only in this, but in other areas as well. So I've known him a long time, and he continues to amaze me. We're going to turn now to our panel with John Sargent and Bill Greenwalt. I'm going to cheat. I sent them questions. I won't ask them. Instead, what I'll do is start by saying, what stood out in Congressman Langevin's speech for you? One of the parts I noted, and we can talk about anything, so tell me what you think, but the purchase of the commercially available products, commercially available technology, which sometimes is not always done as much as we like, but that's one phrase that leapt out at me. John, what did you think about that? And we should note John as an employee of CRS, as a senior staffer there, of course, has to advise Congress. He can't tell them what to do. So with that caveat, please give us your advice. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
There, that better?
Yep.
Sorry about that. I just want to say, yeah, I absolutely enjoyed what the Congressman had to say. I think he has some very strong insights onto the changed global environment for innovation and the changes that need to be made. I think that's the big picture question I think he identified. To me, that is the most profound question we're dealing with, and I think it drives the questions we need to deal with in order to address those changes. And I think in the course of this conversation, I'll discuss that in greater detail.
Great. Bill, how about you?
Sure. This is not a new issue for Congress. Unfortunately, when I didn't have all this gray hair, I was working on a very similar problem in the early 1990s to how do you bring in commercial or how do you get the department to buy commercial? And I think one of the big lessons from that is there are two things. One, there are a lot of commercial products out there that the department should just bring in and really not have to modify to such a great degree. There's another distinction between how do we get the commercial market to work for us? And that requires an entirely different, to build new things and new capabilities for the government on a commercial-like basis, not the traditional way we do things. And with those two distinctions, that's key because we lose that. We think, oh, we're just bringing in something off the shelf. No, we really want the best technologists of the US and the private sector to be working on really hard problems that the Department of Defense needs to deal with. And the problem we have is we have a system that doesn't incentivize that whatsoever. So we have created things where we can buy things off the shelf, but the incentive structure is, I think, the thing we need to really work on.
Let me ask you what you both thought of the congressman pointing us to the NDAA and its S&T strategy. I mean, personally, putting aside the specifics of it, it's great that after so many years we're finally re-engaging in this, because when you look at every other major conflict we've been in, that kind of strategy has been crucial to surviving and then ultimately winning. So when you think of what's been put forward, what are your views? Bill, do you want to start again, and then we can go to John?
Sure. No, I think that is one area where both the SASC and the HASC have tried to focus on. This is our seed corn. This is something we need to continue to build upon. And I think the congressman's point on we wouldn't have got to where we are on the COVID vaccine if we hadn't done the groundwork for the last several decades. All that groundwork needs to take place. The innovation problem we're going to have with China is the fact that China can access that research too, and they are, and probably better than we are. So there's a transition, there's a managerial process environment that needs to take that S&T that, again, has to be robustly funded, and there are a lot of good best practice to do that, but then to take it to the next level. So I think the congressman is working on the right thing, but at the same time, it's the transition, and I think they're doing a lot to try to do that as well. But it's hard. We've been trying to do this for decades.
John.
Yeah, I would say that to move forward, we have to have a common mind share, if you will, of what the challenges are. We have to understand where we've come from and what's different about where we are today. And let me take a minute to talk about a few of those things. So if you take a look at where we were in, say, 1960, coming out of World War II, and we were building very strongly our national security, science and technology capabilities, the federal government funded, the United States funded 69% of global R&D. And the Department of Defense specifically funded 36%, more than a third of global R&D. And what that meant was DoD, with where it chose to spend its dollars, could determine technology development pathways, and it could buy its way into technological leadership and supremacy for the United States and give our troops a military advantage on the battlefield. Flash forward to today, and the federal defense R&D investment accounts for about 3% of global R&D. And that's not because we stopped funding R&D. In fact, federal R&D is now twice as high as it was in 1960 in real terms. It's that the rest of the world and US industry has greatly outstripped the federal investment. So what that means is there's a lot of technology development that is now going on outside of that which is funded by the federal government for the purposes of national security, that we somehow have to find ways to access and to piggyback on. And I think it is a substantial challenge. The capabilities now reside largely in industry and a lot of the key emerging technology areas in things like autonomy and AI, quantum. And we've got to find a way. I think the language is important here, not to bring them into the defense, the national security innovation base, but rather for us to find a way to reach out to them. That we need to take our needs to them and work with them because they're being driven by commercial opportunity. And it's a much larger incentive for them pursuing the global markets for these technologies than for what the federal government provides. Back in 1960, take, for example, the semiconductor industry, the federal government was the market. Today, the federal government is not the market, and the Defense Department is not the market for these technologies. They are a part of the market. So I think this is a case of us needing to go to them. And we've got to find innovative ways to work with them. And I think what this does is stretches the culture of the existing DoD infrastructure which is not built around that paradigm.
We've done 3 reports as part of this project, and they included a lot of interviews with people from startups and from venture capital, and they all said the same thing. You know, it's like this market. And we got a question. If we have time, if people want to submit questions in the Q&A, please do. If we have time, we'll get to them. But this question is exactly on the point that you and Bill made, and so let me read it, and then we'll get back onto our regularly scheduled script. It says, the COTS debate has become tired because DoD procurement is all about specially designed for the committee-created requirements. Our biggest problem is, why would anyone want to sell to the Pentagon? I heard that a lot. I mean, if you're not an incumbent, does this just guarantee that our end users will always be behind the private sector, behind consumers when it comes to accessing technology? So that question hits on some key points, and I think one of the ones is the one you raised, John, which is it's a big commercial market, much bigger than what DoD can offer very, very often. And you don't have the requirements process, which, Bill, you know intimately. So I don't know what you think about that question, but why don't we give it a whack, and then we'll go back.
Well, one thing I would say about that is the thing that is of concern is that because these are technologies that are appearing in the commercial world, it means they're not only available to the United States, but they're available to our adversaries as well. And yes, we do have export control regimes to help prevent some of the flow of that information and technology abroad. But the reality is the knowledge, the information, the foundation for that is highly globalized. And in fact, we train some of the best minds, many, if not most of the best minds here in the United States in our academic institutions. And many of those are not from the United States, and some are from, in fact, adversarial countries. And we have to be concerned that the knowledge that's being developed during this process in these emerging technology fields may potentially be acquired first and used first by our adversaries.
I'll take this from, I think the problem is one of culture, which, as you remember, when the secretary released this, Carter, back in 2015, he didn't want to do culture, but the problem really is culture. And the problem is a series of management processes that optimize a way of thinking that were probably okay in the 60s and 70s when we dominated the market. And so, but there's still this cultural belief that those processes are still adequate to today's environment, and they're not. But no one gets fired, or the incentive structure is not to go beyond those processes. So you have an issue where the department is thinking in timeframes of 10 or 15 years to deliver technology. It's got a 3-year requirements process. It's got a 3-year budget process. It has a 2-year contracting process. That's just to start something. And then a 9-year process to finally go through the traditional contractor to get it done. There is no commercial contractor out in Silicon Valley or anywhere that's thinking along those lines. They're thinking, how can we get revenue in the next year to 2 years? And so the mindset is what is the problem, but it has to do with the processes we have. And so if you don't go around those processes to access this technology, it's not going to happen. So you're left with, and as the question talks about, the traditional contractors who essentially have figured out that this is their comparative advantage. They comply with whatever the government throws at them, and they are happy doing that. And that's fine if you don't have an adversary that's moving as fast as China is today.
Well, let me add a little bit to that, because let me talk about China moving as fast as it moves today. So I think it's important to understand, and I think a lot of people do, but again, we need a common mind share on this. China is engaged in a all-of-nation approach to acquiring and becoming global technology leaders in every critical field. And they are taking every opportunity to do that, some of which is perfectly legal and some of which may not be, is not, in fact. And so we have to be concerned that about every aspect of the way we develop technology and the way we protect it. The Chinese have very rapidly closed the gap in spending on R&D with the United States. The good news is the United States still outspends China by 25% in terms of R&D. And that if you look at the top 10 R&D funding countries in the world, all but 2 of them, China and Russia, are allies of the United States. So the technology being developed should be within our realm to take access to and have access to and to be able to shape to our needs. So we just simply have to find a way, and it's not a simple thing, I shouldn't say that, but it is a cultural change. It's a way of engaging with the private sector that we have not done well in the past.
So we got another question. I'm going to hold it for the moment, though, and go back to our script finally, which was, and ask you both to give kind of an assessment. When Secretary Carter, then Secretary Carter, announced this initiative in 2015, I know that one of the things he was thinking about was the apparent gap, and not everyone agrees it exists, but the apparent gap between DoD and Silicon Valley, and finding ways, and what Mike Brown does is one of the ways that they've developed to try and beat this with DIU. Where do you think we are? How do you assess the progress towards meeting the goal that Carter set at this point 6 years ago? Are we closer in this initiative? Have we made progress? What would you point to? We get to have a critical question later, so this is the happy face question.
Oh gosh, I don't even know if I can be happy. I can be happy in the sense that some great things are being done at DIU, and a couple of the works is out there in the services. I can't point to, because at the same time, when Carter announced this, I was working for Senator John McCain, and Senator John McCain wanted me to, essentially asked, fix this acquisition system so we can create more SpaceXs. Why? Because SpaceX had just essentially created the Falcon 9 at a tenth of the cost of what it would deliver if we use the traditional government way of doing business, and delivered a tenfold performance increase. Okay, and so gosh, if we can do this half as cheaply as these guys did, and come up with only 5 times better performance, let's open it up. So we did open up. We gave the department tremendous authority, and frankly, that either the culture couldn't move that forward. The budget process is probably the biggest problem in getting there. And so we're still treading water. We're making some progress, but we don't have any new SpaceXs. We may have, Palantir has been working around this for 15 years. There are a couple of new startups that look like they might achieve liftoff, but no real big program or records yet.
Yeah, we did a review of the funding for the sort of non-traditional innovators in the national security system, and it's still less than 1% of the total acquisition budget. So that was a bit of a shock. But John, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I think we've made some great progress in reaching out, and I think we've begun to find where the challenges are and begun to address them. I think we've seen some cultural challenges in terms of some employee resistance to wanting to work with the Department of Defense, and culturally being uncomfortable with that. And I think DoD has done a good job on trying to work through those issues and address those concerns. I think it's important, though, while Silicon Valley is obviously a central place in the United States for innovation, there are many other places throughout the United States that are important for us to reach out to as well. And I think there are certainly in the Boston and Austin areas and Research Triangle and other places around the country. I think where we are with the diaspora, if you will, of R&D in the United States and globally, even though it's still highly localized, there are pockets of innovation to be found everywhere. And we've got to find ways to access all of that. We have to be hunters and gatherers now. We can't just be builders of the technology because others are building it. We need to be out there looking and scouting, and not just domestically. We should be out there scouting across our allies, and we should be working closely with them.
Yeah, that's one of the things we were initially looking to try and map the national innovation system. We found not just Silicon Valley, but New York, Texas, North Carolina, Massachusetts, of course. So it has diffused around the US. I use Silicon Valley sometimes as shorthand for this innovation culture. We did get a question, another question though, that kind of fits in with some of what you were talking about. So I'm going to inject it and take us off script again. It was said, using maybe Space Force as an example, that the FY22 NDAA has some commercial first mandates. Do you think those are enough? I mean, one of the things I thought is that we'll come to this at the end. You need Congress to tell people what to do or it's not going to happen. But what do you think of commercial first mandates?
So the first commercial mandate was put into law in 1994. All right. And I probably could just stop there. And it was a pretty strong mandate. All right. I came back in 2015 and wrote an even stronger mandate that was put into law. All right. So here we are in 2021 doing another mandate for Space Force. I'm sorry, there's something else that keeps that from happening. And we can talk through, what those barriers to change are, but it's not there. We probably don't need any more mandates. We need execution. And again, we need a fear of God in the Congress and in the building that we got to do something differently.
John? Yeah.
Well, one of the things, Congress does a bunch of things, right? One of the things it does is it passes laws like the NDAA. The other thing it does is oversight. And I think that's what we're really talking about here. We've got to make sure that not only that the laws that are passed contain the right directions we want the Department of Defense to move in, but also that in fact that they're doing that. And I think that this challenge that Bill points out, that yes, we've got mandates, but why isn't it happening, requires that kind of oversight by Congress.
Well, and I'll just add on that, I agree, oversight is critical and criteria for the oversight, overseers is critical. The problem we have right now is that the GAO and the IGs are not taking that criteria as something that's important. What they're taking is, oh my God, commercial companies, I don't know what their profit margins are. I don't know what it costs. If you look though, it's 1/10 of the cost of what it takes to produce something in the traditional government market, but the auditors want certainty of costs, and certainty of costs can cost 10 times more. That's the craziness. And the Congress listens to that and reacts. And so this is an issue deep down where the overseers, the oversight structure that Congress has created needs to look within itself and see what it's doing to the innovation process, which is essentially keeping us behind. And that's going to really cost us dearly.
Do you think that's changeable? I mean, I agree with you. And I've been thinking about what are some things you could do to change that. And, one of them might be to have conditions on spending that you have to devote more to the innovative part of the acquisitions than before you can spend the other parts, to set thresholds. Is it a budget question more than culture? Is it, I'm not sure how you restructure oversight, but that would be a good goal too.
Well, I think they need to hear from congressional staff and members what's important. I think you also have to see that Congress doesn't need to overreact when they hear and look at these audit reports. But most importantly, you see the department overreacting even before the reports are even out. And that is what really disincentivizes innovation. So for example, the fear of we don't know, we need cost data and we need pricing data from these startups. No, you don't. You need to figure out what it's going to cost to do X, and then you move on. But because of that, the department starts throwing these rules and regulations onto these companies, and after a while, the VC world says this is nuts and walks away, and that's essentially what they've done. So that's why we created other transactions. That's why we have the CSO pilot. That's why we have ways of trying not to to negotiate, ways of negotiating a commercial like contract and not put all this this oversight into the unnecessary oversight into the process. The problem is you're going to have the IG or someone else asking questions about it, and when they do that, you know, people get nervous and they go to, well, what's the best thing? Well, no one's fired me if I go to Lockheed Martin, and that's where we go.
Yeah, this is the fundamental cultural issue, right? It's the question of we want speed, right? And we want efficacy. We want to make sure that we put things quickly into the hands of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen so that they can fight the wars we want them to fight. At the same time, we don't want to have a situation where it looks like somebody got over on the federal government. The reality is, if you're trying to do the type of fundamental change that we have to do in order to move to a new paradigm, like the one that's required of us because of the change in the innovation system, we're going to have a few mistakes along the way. And we have to have a system that's comfortable with mistakes, not fraud, mistakes along the way, and not punish people for making decisions and taking actions to do things in a different way, because all you'll do then is get them to go back to the old way of doing things.
The private sector and other governments also are worried about fraud and mistakes and so on. I think the best thing that the oversight community could do right now is to go off and study that and try to find out what is the best practice out there where you can achieve the balance between effective insight and the knowledge that's necessary versus doing something that's going to just disincentivize innovation and put you behind the 8 ball in the competition with someone like China. And I think that's the oversight community could do that. I think GAO could do that. And I think that would be a really good use of their time and really start thinking through how can they be a player in this, not necessarily an obstacle.
I think the other thing is we have to think of these things that we're doing in different baskets, right? So we are going to do a lot of the things the same way we used to because they're exclusively defense-oriented activities. They're not being driven by the private commercial markets. And the systems we have in place for them, while not perfect, we know how to do those. But then there is this other basket of goods, this other group of technologies that we're trying to advance and bring to market. And the question is, what kind of new tools can we bring to help do that? What are the unique opportunities there? And so the question in my mind is, within our RDTE budget, how much of it should we be investing in the 6.1 through 6.8 process, in the different pieces of it? Yeah, we saw in the president's most recent budget that he looked for cuts in 6.1 through 6.3, and yet that's considered the seed corn for new innovations. And so I heard the congressman say that the House Armed Services Committee has restored that, at least in the NDAA. And so that might be a positive sign. And then there's this question, and Bill, you and I talked about it earlier, of this ability to move things across the valley of death. And that's where you get into funding like 6.4 funding. How do we then take these things that are coming out that look very promising and move them across the finish line and get them into the hands? So I think that's the question. We need to look at this thing as not a single thing, but a bunch of different elements to a comprehensive S&T policy to meet all of our needs.
I think, John, that's just a critical point. There's no one size fits all policy for any of this. But what we do have to do is figure out what is that slice that we need to treat differently. And it might, and it's probably $30 to $50 billion of flexible funding with a different type of oversight strategy, with an entirely, and that's where we're going to innovate. And the rest of it, we're fine with what we've got. We're not going to be innovative. We're not going to be relatively very efficient, because there's probably disruptors that can take that and do amazing things with it. But we need to focus on where we have to compete against China, and that's probably just a small slice. But it's still a big slice.
Well, it's certainly bigger than what we do now, and I think that's a crucial point. Is that when you look at it as a percentage of what we spend on technology for national security, we're not talking the bulk of it. We're not talking about a wholesale shift. We're talking about, I don't know, 10, 20% moving in the right direction. And in that regard, We've identified a couple areas here. We've identified culture, which I would say is mainly cultural attitudes towards risk. Your point about nobody ever gets fired for going to one of the primes. We've identified policy as you need policies and funding. We've talked about budget processes and budget allocations. How about authorities? Someone brought up OTA. I hear from some people OTA is now being sort of sucked into the oversight and regulatory system. Do we have the right authorities? Do we need new authorities, or we just need a new way to implement them?
Well, OTAs have transitioned over the years. The commercial FAR Part 12 authorities were probably written in such a way that they could have been used and could have done everything we needed, and we only needed OTAs for negotiation of intellectual property rights and so on. The reality is, because the oversight community and the department ruined FAR 12 and completely destroyed the ability to do what was necessary for it, a lot of what could be done under FAR 12 migrated to OTA. And that's actually crowding out now the real OTAs that we need to do with companies that would never do business with us. So even that bulk, of 6 billion or whatever we're now doing OTAs, a lot of that probably should be under FAR 12, and OTA should be doing something else in an entirely different way. So yeah, and OTAs are now being loaded up with FAR clauses and things like that, and before long we're going to have to create something new. That's just ridiculous. We should just figure out how to do FAR 12 and clean that up the way it should be, and really get a template of OTAs that are necessary. But that gets us around the contracting process. You also have to deal with the requirements process, which we tried to in Section 804 authority, mid-tier authority. You need to get around the budget process, which is another 3-year time suck, which is just not going to work. So you need a pot of flexible money. We need to deal with technology transfer, and we need to deal with the security arrangements that are around it. Other large barriers that keep out innovative companies from ever wanting to do business with DoD. But all of those, the authorities are there. There's flexible workarounds if the government wants to do it. The problem is just the will and the top cover to actually have the executors in the field actually to do this.
I think that's exactly right. I think we have to identify. First of all, I do think the authorities are there. And yeah, there's always room for improvement, and there can be modification of some of the authorities. And who knows, maybe we'll find a few innovative people who will come out with whole new innovative ideas and good ideas to do. That would be great. But there's a lot of authority already there. And DoD has a lot of flexibility in dealing with the way it goes about doing these things. But I think the point you hit on was exactly right. You have to identify where there are the internal cultural barriers that make management decisions go in the wrong direction under the current system, right? Where they encourage them to avoid risk for the fear of failure and the fear of personal career collapse, if you will. We need to make sure that they are comfortable making decisions. Look, if you're working in advanced technologies, your expectations of failure are high, and it's okay. You want to fail fast, right? We want to learn from our mistakes and move forward. And we don't need to be having to explain every mistake ad infinitum. We need to make the mistake, learn from it, and move forward. And hopefully we'll get, as has always been the case, 1 or 2 good successes out of every 10 projects that we push forward at the emerging technology field.
If there were 2 authorities that I failed at getting in the Hill, it would have been one, a greater number of flexible budget accounts to actually move fast and get on contract fast, because you can get on contract fast with an OTA in 30 days if you so chose to. Okay, so it's the funding that's the holding things up. And the second one is, just like we created commercial item exemptions from all the laws of acquisition laws, some type of and intellectual property laws for commercial items. we should do something like that in the export control arena to give clarity of understanding. If a commercial company comes to the Department of Defense, its entire apparatus that it's built up is not going to be ITAR'd. And that is to me is the same type of commercial item exemption that created FAR 12 could be done in the export control world if we put our minds to it. But those are my two failures.
That's one I also heard repeatedly, is if I make this product, won't everything become controlled as ammunition?
Yeah.
And you can say no till you're blue in the face. But honestly, I don't know if it's no, right? So it's a reasonable risk that deters people.
There are so many horror stories out there from just within a commercial company, you know, and these are sophisticated companies that deal with defense, that the commercial side of the house, engineers and the defense guys talked, and that just tainted their commercial technology. And you know, whether they're eventually solvable or not, it requires lots of money, lots of lawyers, lots of process. And all that does is create barriers to actually having, what we need to do is have engineers talking to engineers about DoD problems. I'd like to see that. And whether they're engineers from the UK or engineers from Australia or engineers from the same company, let's get them together.
So we're down to about the last 5 minutes. And we got a couple more questions. I'll sort of combine them. Somebody asked, you know, what are the prospects for any of the ideas you're suggesting happening? Not entirely fair, but I'm going to reframe it a little bit by saying, you know, in 2 or 3 minutes, tell us what you do, concrete, actionable steps. What would you want to see? I'm changing the culture. Good luck. But there are things you can do. So I don't know who wants to start, John or Bill. What would you do that would be different? So now we're thinking of not this year's bill, but maybe a bill next year or 2 years out.
Well, first of all, you'll need a champion, and the champions like Congressman Langevin or others are going to have to see that there's a real threat out there. And I worked for Senator McCain back in the day, and Senator McCain, for many things, was kind of a part of the problem until he figured out that we've got to change to compete against China. So you need a compelling case for change. And then what needs to be done right now from the Congress is give the department some flexibility in funds, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, whether it's data analytics, whatever, so that they can go back to the way we used to innovate, which was on a time-based basis, and bringing in the industrial base and having them compete for the ability to solve DoD's problems. That's one, budget. And the other is I really would work for some type of way to ensure that collaboration can take place with these commercial companies so that they can protect their intellectual property and protect their ability to sell in the global marketplace. Because if you don't solve that problem or address it, it's not going to happen.
John?
Well, I think I'd probably go back to, I believe is a Churchill quote, right? I tend to be an optimist. Churchill said, the Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I think we'll find the right things. I think we are finding the right things. I think it is a messy process, much like most of our democracy is. And as we go through it, there's political pulls and there are economic pulls and there are policy pulls in different directions. But ultimately, I think we're heading in the right direction. But one of the things I think that we haven't quite figured out yet is, you know, when we had, again, talk about the strategic change in the innovation system and who our adversary is. When we were dealing in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the Soviet Union was our adversary, right? We knew who the enemy was, and we didn't trade with them. And our companies were not fully intertwined with Russia. Today, we live with a very different situation. And I don't think there's a common perspective on China. I think there's a kind of a growing consensus, if you will, that China is an emerging threat, but we are directly and massively integrated with them economically. I think there's some efforts to try to extract some of that in critical areas like the CHIPS Act is trying to do and bringing some of the semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. But the reality is right now we have very integrated economy with China. And so we've got to figure out how this works with respect to technology development. We've got American companies that are operating closely hand in hand with in the commercial world in China. And the Chinese government's policy is a very clear one, which is, yes, we will bring you in, we will be your partner, and we will learn from you, and we will spin that technology off inside, and we will develop domestic competitors, and we will supplant you. And so we've got to understand, I think, who the adversary is and how they operate. And I don't think that that common understanding is there yet. But again, I remain optimistic broadly.
I would throw one thing in there just as a thing, and that would be that the Congress should be looking at all the programs, whatever it does, in short time increments and assessing how well they're delivering, in 3 to 5 years. If they're not getting anything in 3 to 5 years, that program should be shot. That's the way we used to innovate, and that's not the way we innovate anymore. And so it's effective oversight and clearly defined metrics on what you're going to deliver and in a 3 to 5 year time frame.
Yeah, I think we've hit some key points in these concluding remarks. We got a couple more questions that I don't think we'll have time for, but someone brought up the CHIPS Act and how important it was. Someone asked about the transition from the Cold War model of innovation to the new model and what that means for IP protection and what the effect is there. I'll just say that on the point about, I think there's a increasing awareness of the problem with China. It hasn't reached the point where people are willing to sacrifice some of the sacred cows that we've brought along in the last few years. But if there was one area of bipartisan consensus on the Hill, I'd say it's on China. So I kind of agree with John and with Bill. We're moving in the right direction. There's a question of pace, and there's a question of getting people, maybe a champion, to do the right things. But I will say that on the Chinese point, I was on a Chinese television show, and they said, "Why are the Americans so angry at us?" And I kept saying, "Because we read your speeches." So I hope they got mad at that and said, "We know you read our speeches." It's like, well, you guys are out to get us. And I think there's that awareness. Now we just have to figure out how to operationalize it. And so that's a good transition, not great, but a good transition to our final speaker. Bill, John, let me thank you for an exceptionally insightful discussion. I think it was really useful. And Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim. And want to thank you for putting together such a great panel. Really enjoyed the comments from both John and Bill. And I find myself always agreeing with comments from Bill, but also with yours today, John. Let's go back to where Congressman Langevin started. We never want to send warfighters into a fair fight. I think we all agree with that. I've heard many recent secretaries of defense make that same comment. The question is how to do that. And two things have changed fundamentally over the last 50 years. One, the rise of commercial technology, which has been discussed already here, and the fact that who's leading a lot of that development? The consumer. So it's a very different environment than we faced 50 years ago. And the other is the rise of China. And as already been pointed out, John did a great job. This is a different kind of competition, which is based on economics and technology, much less military. So we're talking today about the military implications of that, but the strategic competition that we're in with China is really about their economy and ours and the use of technology as they use that to try and grow and take over some industries in the world. If we read their speeches, as you said, Jim, they're all about that with Made in China 2025 and other of their industrial policy programs. And we will ignore their speeches at our own peril because while they're not successful in all their goals, they're making some pretty good progress. Let's talk about the assessment. 6 years ago, Ash Carter formed DIU and several other innovative organizations, DDS, the Defense Innovation Board. For DIU's part, I'm pretty proud of what we've done. We've started over 125 projects. We've transitioned 30 capabilities to the Department of Defense. We brought in more than 70 first-time DoD suppliers. In a year now, we see 1,000 submissions from companies to work with DoD. That's on average 40 for every project that we undertake. So we're building some momentum. We just started this year an effort, National Security Innovation Capital, which Congress funded to look at future vendors in the hardware space that we'd like to have. Areas like batteries, quantum sensors, and other areas that typically have been funded more by Chinese investment than even our own venture capital. So we're making some progress, but your points are spot on. We're not moving fast enough, and we're not at the scale that makes sense. Your comment about us affecting less than 1% of DoD procurement means we haven't tied together innovation with the mainstream procurement arms of the Pentagon, which says we've got a systemic problem that we've got to address here. So when I look at what's happened over the past couple of years, my conclusion is we really are in a very different space than we were 50 years ago, where our systems were developed, our acquisition, our requirement systems, our budgeting systems, for when we led the world in technology. John gave some great statistical underpinnings of that in terms of we're in a world where we're a follower now at DoD for many of the technologies, not all, not for hypersonics maybe, but for the 8 of the 10 modernization priorities that DoD has. We're talking about AI, cyber, autonomous systems, bioengineered materials. We're not the leader in the marketplace. We are very much one consumer among many. So we have to make DoD an attractive customer, which is the role of DIU. I'm not worried about job security because that's a very high hurdle for us to get over. But back to the systemic part of this, we need to think about the fact that if we're not the first mover, which is what we were in the era of semiconductors when the government was the market, where we were an early investor and early adopter. And we've now moved to an era where consumers are leading this technology race. How do we adapt to what in the tech world is a fast follower strategy? So there's 6 things that I think we should do, which incorporate the great ideas I heard from John and Bill in terms of what we need to do to move forward. One is put together our best tools and practices for commercial acquisition. The mandate is very clear, as Bill outlined, and it's been in place for now going on 30 years. We just need to start executing. We have the tools, but we don't often use them. And so I think this is a matter of leadership from the top, guidance that we need. We need to be executing. We need to measure ourselves in execution. We need the training through Defense Acquisition University. This needs to be much more of a career field that's recognized. All those things that we need to do to institutionalize the tools and authorities we already have. So good examples of this would be the commercial solutions opening process. It maximizes competition and minimizes the burden on companies to respond. That's why we're getting 1,000 submissions a year from companies that want to participate. We need to make it clear who the front door is at DoD. It's pretty hard to figure out with all the different innovation organizations we've set up. There's work we could do there to make it easier to navigate. And one of the points that Bill made, I think, is a key here, really collaboration with the warfighters to have the engineers talking to each other. It's one of the things we've tried to incorporate. We're made up of folks from every branch of the service, and we have them talking to the companies. And we also try and bring the customer or DoD mission partner into those discussions. We have to do that to make sure that we have warfighters talking to engineers to come up with best solutions. That's what the commercial market does. Second, speed. The commercial market moves at a much different speed. And Bill talked about decades of what it takes to bring new capabilities in a traditional system. That doesn't cut it. The third is budgeting. Bill talked about this. We need not only a sustained budget for these commercial priorities, things like commercial satellites, small drones, which we don't have today. If you're not in a program of record, you're in a no man's land. And we also need the flexibility that Bill talked about. When urgent needs come up, commercial companies are developing solutions well within the 3-year budget cycle. So we can't wait 3 years to specify something that we're in need and then to ask leading companies to wait for the budget process to catch up. There's no reason for that. The next element we need is organizational structure that is accommodating to these commercial priorities. So the examples I just gave, commercial satellite imagery, small drones, there's no home for those within DoD. Each service is splintering in terms of coming up with its own requirements, and then we don't aggregate the buying power of the Defense Department or federal government. That could change if we thought about where are the homes for these commercial technologies that we need, because we're going to need to refresh what we do. It's not one and done like a long destroyer program or aircraft carrier. We need to think about qualifying the best capability today and then moving at a commercial pace to qualify the next generation in a year or 18 months, or we take more risk than we need to with our warfighters. We're not making sure the warfighters are in a fair fight. And then the last point I'd make is allies. The competition between the US and China does not need to be bilateral. One of our asymmetric advantages as a country is our allies. We should be sourcing this commercial technology from companies in allied countries, and then we should be figuring out a way to sell the qualified solutions back to those allies. So those 6 things make up what I call a fast follower strategy. We need the mindset, the cultural change to make that a priority. And we can be an optimist like John is and ensure that America is on the right path. Thank you very much, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Well, thanks to everyone for watching this event. I'm going to just echo some of what Mike said. Identifying the tools and using them. Speed, which John, Bill, Mike have all pointed out as crucial, and a crucial difference. Funding, and the point that a couple of you made, sustained funding. This is not something we can just, Congressman Langevin said this as well. It's going to be more than 1 year. We're in a long-term conflict, and we have to recognize that. Organizational structure, some progress there. A home for innovation, a home for the tech base and DoD and other agencies. And finally, working with allies. There's some progress there. We'll see if anything comes out of the Tech and Trade Council. There's some work in the Five Eyes to try and find ways to cooperate on technology. We've done, to echo John's point, we've done okay so far at identifying the steps we need to take. And I think Bill and Mike have talked about how we could do it, but we know what we need to do, at least in general terms. And the next step now is to actually do it. I'm an optimist too in that regard, but it won't happen automatically. We're all going to have to do a little pushing. With that, let me thank you for attending this event. If you have questions, feel free to send them to us here at CSIS, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.